Welcome, foolish mortals, back to the villain's lair. And like the prince in this particular Disney movie, today's villain is often thought to be completely unnamed in the movie in which she is featured. We're talking about Disney's first animated feature, Snow White. Queen Grimhilde is the first animated character of all time to deliver any lines in any animated feature-length film. So you'd think her name would be a little more memorable. However, like Prince Florian, her name is never mentioned in Disney's Snow White. So if you've never heard of Grimhilde, don't be alarmed. They never say her name. She is Snow White's stepmother. She has married the king, who then later passed away. It's never directly said whether or not she killed him, so kind of like Lady Tremaine, you're left to decide whether this character is dark enough to have actually taken that next step. However, given the things we see her do for her own vanity, one can only imagine what she'd be willing to do for power. She is someone who is described in a 1938 pamphlet as someone who has sold their body and soul, all of themselves, to the dark spirits of the mountains, which would be the mountains in the Black Forest region of Germany. So clearly, before her vanity and Snow White are even involved, we're dealing with a very dark individual. Her mirror is considered one of the keys to her power, or at least to her knowledge and wisdom. Mirrors, at the time that this tale of Snow White was originally told, were generally considered to be magical objects, which is why they are featured in so many various stories from the time. For example, the Snow Queen also prominently features a mirror in its mythology, and they were often considered to be enchanted. That's because mirrors were a really rare thing during the time when these stories were put together. They were something only the affluent and powerful could have, and therefore were associated with affluence and power. However, their ability to reflect you back in them also was considered partially mystical. During the time period, they created actual mirrors that were called magic mirrors that often had basically kind of a tubing system within them to transfer sound, so it sounded as though the magic mirror was speaking or singing to you. However, it was just the sound of the air going through these tubes. There was no actual magical quality about it, but that's thought to be where a lot of these myths of magic mirrors come from and why they're so common from this time period and this part of the world. The mirror contains the queen's slave, who is also her familiar, and through using this particular, let's call it an entity, since we're not really sure technically what he is, Disney's Once Upon a Time theorizes that he is a genie. However, given that this is someone that the queen has sold her soul to or to obtain, it never really clarifies, it's often hypothesized to also be a demon. But if you do a lot of research into genies and demonology, often you'll find that they're synonymous. They're just different cultures' names for the same sort of creature. So could be either one, could be both. This is the device she uses to find out that eventually her stepdaughter, Snow White, has become more beautiful than her. This already takes a serious blow to her self-worth. If you think about it, she got her position and power by being the most beautiful woman in the world at the time. She was married and made queen because of her beauty, not her intelligence, not her political fortitude. She was made queen because she's gorgeous. And so to then be knocked down a peg on the gorgeousness scale to her is not just a threat to her vanity. I mean, I'm sure it's that, but it's also a threat to her position, to her place of power, because hey, if this is how I got here, then the next most beautiful girl could easily just bump me right off, right? At least that's how I picture her motivation to be. Otherwise, I can't understand killing your stepchild, or in the original fairy tale, your actual child, in order to, just soothe your vanity. Because usually having a beautiful child, it seems like, would pamper your vanity, because you're like, hey, look at those chromosomes I put in over there. Nope. No, she takes this as a deliberate assault on her looks, and I think to some extent an assault on her power. This is only further throws her into a tailspin when she notices that the prince is also in love with Snow White and is singing his one song, and believe me, that's the only lines he has in the movie, is that one song, to Snow White. And so from here we think about the roots of the Julia Roberts version of the evil queen, where she tries to seduce the prince and finds that she can't because Snow White really has taken up her position as the most beautiful, the fairest in the land. And so this kind of is mirrored in the Disney version. However, in their version it's just a glance at the prince through the window, very ominous silhouette of the queen there. But you know, it's summarized in that, her jealousy that this desirable prince desires her stepdaughter and not her. She's used to being the center of all attention, especially romantic attention within the kingdom. And so the fact that she's not right now is what pushes her tumbling over the edge. She orders her huntsman to take Snow White away and kill her, to cut out her heart. And in the original fairy tale, but Disney kindly tucked this away from us, she orders the huntsman to bring her heart so that she can eat it. There are many ancient and very dark religious practices that see the eating of an opponent's body parts as a way to absorb the particular strength from that opponent or from that body part. Some cultures used to eat an opponent's eyes to allow you to gain their wisdom. So I think that in the ancient Black Forest culture, this is probably where this concept comes from. She wants to eat Snow White's heart in order to gain her youth, her beauty, and her power. Snow White has a very direct claim to the throne, too, and so I think in an attempt to get rid of the heir, this is again her trying to secure not only her vanity, but her power. The huntsman, who has probably been around Snow White her entire life, he just can't do it, even though he's very loyal to the queen. So he kills a pig, puts a pig's heart in the box, and of course the mirror calls him out on it later and tells the queen the truth of what really happened. So the queen decides she's going to deal with this disobedient huntsman later. Her first priority is to take down Snow White. She goes down into her, well, what Yzma would call her secret lab. It's super spooky dungeon underneath her castle. Originally in the Disney story, there was going to be a whole torture scene for the prince in here where she would attempt to get him to marry her just to prove to herself that he wanted her. Not because she loved him, just because she wanted that validation of her beauty. And so when he would refuse, she would torture him and then eventually left him there with water flowing into it in order to drown him, because he was such a insult to her beauty. So in Disney, we see her make a magic apple that causes the sleeping death. She intends to deliver this to Snow White, who eats it. The queen's intention then is that while Snow White is not technically dead, it's just in a kind of comatose state, her intention is for her friends, the dwarves, to bury Snow White alive, thus killing her on their own without her having to actually deal the blow. However, like most Disney villains, she, sticks around long enough to see Snow White eat the apple, but she doesn't stick around for the actual burying process because she's caught. The dwarves have found her thanks to Snow White's animal friends. Another Disney cliche that I just still kind of love. I used to believe with my whole heart that I could befriend all the forest animals by singing to them because it worked for her, right? It never really worked for me, but it works for Snow. That's part of what makes her special. So the animals and the dwarves all go chasing the witch. She climbs further and further in the mountains to try and escape the dwarves, but the dwarves work in these mountains. They climb these mountains every day, and they are way faster climbers than a rickety old lady. So they eventually start catching up to her. She attempts to roll a large boulder down on top of them, but in the process, lightning strikes the cliff edge that she's on, and she falls down with the boulder falling on top of her. And the vultures in the next shot lead us to conclude that she is no more. What Disney left out of this original version of the story, other than the true relationship between Snow White and the Queen, is that the Queen actually made 3 different attempts to kill Snow White. First, she brought her a corset that would tighten until it crushed her ribs and making it so she can't breathe. She would suffocate to death. The dwarves show up in time to rescue her from this fate. Similarly, she gets a poison comb that when Snow White puts it into her hair, it scrapes her scalp and she begins to die from exposure to the poison. However, the dwarves again remove the comb before she can get enough of the poison to pass away. You'd think at this point that she'd, kind of stop dealing with peddler ladies coming to the door because nothing good comes of it, but of course she tries again with the apple. Now, another thing Disney left out is that in the original fairy tale, it is not the prince's kiss that actually wakes Snow up from her coma. The piece of apple that she bit is lodged in her throat, rendering her unconscious. When the prince comes to take Snow White away, presumably for a proper burial, one of the coffin carriers accidentally drops the end of the coffin. The jolt kind of shakes that chunk of apple loose. She coughs it up, is able to breathe again, and goes and marries the prince. Now, enter back to the queen's throne room. She talks to her magic mirror again. Magic mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? The magic mirror answers that the bride of the prince of a nearby country is the fairest woman in the world. Well, the queen, decides, well, she's better get rid of this person now because, hey, if I'm a killer, I may as well be a serial killer, right? Well, one foot in front of the other. We've all got goals. A serial killer is hers. So she decides she's going to go hunt down this other princess. Conveniently, she's invited to this princess's wedding. When she goes, she finds to her embarrassment that the princess is Snow White, and as punishment for her crimes, the queen is given a pair of red-hot iron shoes and is forced to dance in them at Snow White's wedding reception until she dies. So if you thought being crushed by a boulder was a pretty harsh death, I think the grim version is, well, more grim. Disney was kind enough, I think, to leave out the elements of torture and cannibalism that are present in the original Snow White. I think just because, I don't know. I guess they just figured kids don't exactly love that stuff. I don't know that kids don't love that stuff. I think kids' parents don't love kids loving that stuff. And so, no cannibalism for you. A lot of the struggles Disney had while making this movie were making the queen as incredibly beautiful as she's supposed to be, but also keeping her scary looking. It was a very difficult balance for them to find that difference between beauty and terror. And so they kind of just opted for making her a deliberate contrast to Snow White. She dresses in a lot of cool colors. Snow White dresses in warm colors, a lot of reds and yellows, very bold blue, whereas Grimhilde has, darker purples and blacks. They deliberately made her very sultry. She has a very hourglass silhouette. She's very curvy to kind of show her maturity and sensuality, whereas Snow White, while she's 14, she's relatively curveless. She's very, very young looking, even for 14. And so they've tried to kind of contrast that, not only developmental physically, but have that be a parallel to their development kind of emotionally and mentally. Snow White has this innocence, whereas the queen has other ways to get what she wants. She is a parallel too in two different versions of herself. She has enormous duality for our first villain. Like I said, she is both beautiful and evil, which is not something we see terribly often in Disney movies. Often the beautiful characters are the good ones and the ugly characters are the bad ones. So right out of the gate, Disney went ahead and broke that mold before they even made that mold by making this beautiful character evil. Now, her witch version or old hag version of herself is supposed to be a reflection of what she's truly like on the inside. It is a reflection of her heart and her soul, of those precious parts of her that she sold to the dark spirits of the mountains. And so it is kind of a reflection of what she truly looks like underneath it all. There are a lot of great fan theories about Grimhilde. Isaac from Watso Videos states that he thinks that she is someone who has been on the receiving end of a fairy godmother, since fairy godmothers and enchantresses have been shown to give the gifts of magic mirrors throughout the Disney universe. I have to personally disagree with this because of the 1938 promotional pamphlet for this movie that states that she sold herself, body and soul, to these evil spirits. I think that's enough of a source of dark magic. I don't think you would need the magic mirror from that other source, but it is an incredible video, and he always does great research. He's very fun to watch, so I will go ahead and leave a link in the description of this video. But yeah, definitely check out Snow White, see what you think Grimhilde's motivations are, what psychologically drives this person. It's difficult to nail down because unlike Mother Gothel, we don't get a lot of lines, we don't have a villain song, there's not a lot to draw from her psychology for, and I think a lot of this is because movies at the time were so short, and since this was the first animated movie, it was especially short, and they weren't sure how far they could push that limit. So I think if they had had more time to develop her further, it could have done her some good as far as understanding her psychology. But she's definitely a fascinating character. She's pretty black and white, evil character. There's not a lot of guesswork to be done with her. And so she's definitely one of the most compelling Disney villains in Disney history, because she's the one who kick-started it all. And I don't know, she's a lot of fun to kind of watch and analyze, because it's someone who has all the potential to be a great character, and they chose a different path. If you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and comment in this video. Also, like and subscribe if you do want to follow us. If you're interested in what you heard here and would like to hear more, you can go ahead and contact me on our Patreon page, www.patreon.com/shiveringmouse. We do a free episode on the Disney parks every Friday, and a patron-only episode on the storybook roots of Disney stories on Wednesday. So I'll look forward to hearing from you there, and thank you so much for tuning in today.